So I'm happy to say hello and welcome to another curatorial conversation at the Warburg Institute. This is a series we started a couple of years ago with my colleague Michelle O'Malley, where we tried to go behind the scenes at museums and galleries. We sometimes discuss current exhibitions or upcoming exhibition projects, but we sometimes take a broader look at how some of our most interesting institutions are tackling bigger issues, including the more or less total lack of museum exhibitions at the moment under the long lockdown. Now, these virtual events, which are of course hosted on Zoom, have made everybody much more casual, and I cannot remember the last time I actually wore a tie, but this time I felt that I needed to wear a suit. And after all, Chris is already smiling because he knows what's coming. After all, our speaker today literally wrote the book on the suit. And not only did he write a book called The Suit, but he inscribed it for me saying that I always wear a nice suit. And so I absolutely felt compelled today not to let him down. So Chris, I am actually also wearing bottoms. I've got a suit on a top and bottom. So our guest is in fact none other than Christopher Breward, author of The Suit, Form, Function, and Style. And that title is a good introduction to his background. He is one of the world's foremost experts on the history of fashion, masculinity, and urban culture. He also made his way to the directorship of National Museums Scotland via an unusual and impressive range of posts across the museum and university sector with a strong focus on art and design. He was the head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where he did his PhD in the V&A RCA History of Design program. He was the principal of the Edinburgh College of Art, and he was the director of collections and research at the National Galleries of Scotland. Chris took up this exciting new post just a few weeks, I think, after the start of the global pandemic. And one of the first questions I'm going to be asking him is how he has managed to get to grips with a massive organization that he has only visited in person a handful of times. But we thought it would be a good idea to start with a kind of tour of the NMS through the eyes of its director. And Chris has kindly prepared to give us an overview of the buildings and the collections, which are, as you'll see, far larger and more diverse than many of us realized. So Chris, welcome. And I am here at the ready to advance your slides when needed.
Great. Good. Well, thank you very much, Bill. I'm very relieved you're wearing both the top and bottom half of a suit. I did wear a tie yesterday, actually, for it was our trustees committee. So I do wear one occasionally, and how wonderful it is to get up in the morning and put a tie on in these days. So I thought this Indeed. Was more of an informal chat. So, and I'm just going to talk very briefly. I'm sure many people are very familiar with the museums in Scotland, National Museums of Scotland. But it's worth just going through the different aspects of our organisation. So if you just move through to that first slide of Chamber Street next, which is perhaps the most iconic of our buildings in the centre of Edinburgh. There's a complex history here. We are the amalgamation, as many national museums are, of several different preceding and surviving organisations as well. So I would say that the roots of our collection and our organisation, the earliest roots, date back to 1780 and the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. Various collections associated and collected by the Society at this moment in Scotland and Edinburgh in particular, their history. That they came together in 1851 into public ownership as the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, and moved in 1891. They weren't in this building, they were scattered across Scotland to Queen Street. those of you familiar again with Edinburgh's national museums will know that the Scottish National Portrait Gallery is in Queen Street in that handsome red sandstone building. And it once shared that building in the 1890s with the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland. And remained there, those collections, until 1995, when, and just 10 years before that, in 1985, the National Museums of Antiquities merged with the Royal Scottish Museums. And the Royal Scottish Museums, if you're keeping up with me, had been founded in 1854 as the Industrial Museum of Scotland, with very close links to the University of Edinburgh. So sited really in this district here. And that institution, I think, is really the true context in which National Museums of Scotland now operates. It had international scope in terms of its collecting and a very strong relationship with the University of Edinburgh and its collections and its teaching, and a strong social mission to particularly educate the poorer classes, and particularly poorer women, actually. George Wilson, the first director of the Industrial Museum. So quite close to the South Kensington system, but with a particular Scottish flavour. It was renamed the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art, and in 1866, this building opened. Interestingly designed by Francis Fawkes, who part of the Ministry of Works, also responsible for parts of the Victoria and Albert Museum in South Kensington. So there's a close relationship there, and various museums around the British Empire at that time. So 1866, key date for this building. 1985, the new merged organisation was created as the National Museums of Scotland. And a new building was erected at the end of this building in 1998. That opened, but a long time in terms of its formation, to house the Scottish history and archaeology collections. So both institutions really came together in the late 1990s, when actually Mark Jones, one of our predecessors at the at South Kensington, was director of the National Museums of Scotland then. So if you go through the through to the next slide, here's the interior, the Fawkes interior, world cultures, natural sciences, and brought together with Scottish history and archaeology in the new building at the end. And really a momentous moment in 2011, Bill, when I left the V&A research department to move to Edinburgh to take up the university role. This new iteration of the Chambers Street building opened, having been renovated over a period since 2006 in a first phase. And it is an extraordinarily light-filled, inspiring space to come up into from the basement. If you move through to the next slide, science and technology, a strong part of the collection, was part of the next phase after 2011. And this is one of our iconic objects. All museums have to have a mascot or an iconic object, and ours is probably Dolly the sheep, the first cloned mammal from an adult sheep cell. That sort of global scientific invention from in Edinburgh. So we love Dolly. She kept us all going through COVID closure. And the next slide in that building, and then part of the recent, very recent acquisition. And this was the exhibition that would have been opening in 2 weeks' time, had we been open, but part of Scottish history and archaeology, the Galloway Hoard. So a very rich collection at one end of that building of material relating to Scotland's history. And the next slide there, Bill. And here are the natural sciences at one end, the other end of the Fowlkes building, which were rethought as an extraordinary sort of panorama of species in 2011. And I came to the opening in 2011, July, with Beth McKillop, formerly Director of Collections at the V&A, and the late much Miss Maura Gemmell, Director of Design, Head of Design at the V&A, for the opening party, because they knew I'd just been appointed to the University of Edinburgh. So I sneaked an invitation and sat in the party at a table at one end of this gallery, I remember, never thinking that I would be joining the museum at a later stage in 10 years' time, I guess. So next slide for Chamber Street. And as part of the more recent renovation of the galleries, we opened our new art and design galleries, our technology galleries, as I say, and our Ancient Egypt, East Asia, and ceramics galleries between 2014 and 2019. So pretty recent additions to that Chamber Street site. There's the East Asian galleries upstairs. And then we'll just quickly move on to our other sites, because we're a family of museums. We have the National Museum of Flight that you can see here, and that's based at an iconic former Second World War airfield in East Fortune. That joined with the National Museums of Scotland in 1971, when the Ministry of Defence donated a Spitfire to the then Royal Museum. There wasn't anywhere to house it as part of the technology collection. So it was housed in a hangar with a growing collection of aeronautical objects. And the museum itself opened in 1975. And it's part heritage airfield, Second World War, very important site in terms of military history, and then houses iconic aircraft, many of which are associated with Scotland's aviation and engineering legacy. If we go to the next slide, you can see there an interior of one of the fairly recently renovated hangars. I was a trustee at one stage of the National Museum of Scotland while this development was about to open. They were freezing, huge cold hangars, underfloor heating put in, extremely popular with a family audience, and really to us a godsend during the lockdown period, because a big Second World War ex-RAF airfield and huge hangars are very easy in terms of the logistics of opening safely. And the next slide. And probably one of our most iconic exhibits is the Concorde. So at the moment that we reopened our first museum in the summer, last summer, I was in that hangar. I was the first person to run up those steps and run through the fuselage of Concorde, because that object always brings me to my knees. It's such a beautiful, elegant, exciting thing. So I'm thrilled to become a director that has a Concorde as part of our collection. And the next slide. And then we have the National Museum of Rural Life, just outside of East Kilbride, to the west of Scotland. And the National Museum of Rural Life originally opened in 1982 as the Scottish Agricultural Museum. It relocated to this site in 2001 with this beautiful building, not seen quite to its best advantage by the Glasgow architects Page and Park there in this barn construction. And if you go to the next slide, with a very extensive collection of agricultural machinery, implements and objects associated with everyday life. Extraordinary collection really, in this new building from the beginning of this century. Again, Mark Jones responsible for that transition when he was director. And the next slide. It's really a museum with its roots, I think, in the sort of social history experience. So rather different in feel from the rest of our sites. And again, very popular, as you might imagine, with a family audience. And the next slide here. And there's a historic farm as part of the site up the road. That's why that truck was in there to take people up to the farm, 18th century farm, run by the National Trust Scotland. So we have a joint relationship on the site. But what really fascinates me about this aspect of our collection is we have live objects, live animals. They're all part of the museum collection, rare breeds, and the farm runs as a working farm. And again, very important for our morale during this period. So next slide. Our other icon was Fiona, the foal, who was born last summer, just as we opened to the public again. And the next slide. And then we have the National War Museum in Edinburgh Castle. And the War Museum was founded in 1930 as the United Services Museum, joined the Royal Scottish Museum as was in 1970, and was refurbished at the millennium in 2000. It reopened then as the National War Museum of Scotland. The next slide. Some slides covering regimental history and Scotland's place in military campaigns. And the next slide. And final building is the National Museum's Collection Centre to the north of Edinburgh in Granton on the Forth. And I would say that this is a collections and research hub, part of a big regeneration scheme in North Edinburgh at the moment, but this is where our conservation labs and our museum stores and our research facilities are located. And it's an extraordinary facility in which much work happens behind the scenes. And the next slide. So you can see here there are highly accessible collections, and a lot of live, very important scientific work takes place given the range of our collection, and also our conservation studios. This was a recent conservation of one of those iconic objects. The thin red line painting from our war museum was reglazed and conserved just as I came into the museum as director, but there in Granton. And the next slide, and I think that's it, Bill, in terms of an overview of the diversity of our buildings and our collection.
Fantastic.
We cover every aspect of
you really do. You really do. I'm going to use, I know you've got a couple more slides here about both your own background, but also about the challenges of coming in as director, as I said, just after the beginning of the global pandemic. Maybe we could just start a little bit with this becoming a director, and then go through the COVID slides, and then maybe we'll stop the slideshow and just talk to each other. I mean, the thing that strikes me, because I also had the pleasure of following in your footsteps, it was also quite daunting because you left quite a high bar and a strong reputation in South Kensington at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It's very interesting to see, and I think you've got the building there. Yeah, it's very interesting to see the close connections, particularly with the Chambers Street building that you started with this model. And maybe can you say a little bit more, because not everybody will know this program, the so-called South Kensington program, and the fact that it was actually called Science and Art, whereas this museum here was also, before it was the V&A, which didn't happen until the early 20th century, was in fact the South Kensington Museum run by the Department of Science and Art. So this science and art idea, do you want to say a little bit more about that? Because it looks like it's more intact there than it is in South Kensington.
In a sense, although I always think that that Albertopolis and South Kensington, in terms of the range of institutions with their connected histories, is quite similar. I mean, it forms, I think, my own intellectual universe, which is why I'm so thrilled and at home to be at National Museums Scotland, because of course I, as you said, very kindly talked about my background at the beginning, Bill, but I almost feel, even though it's 150 years later, that when I did my master's program between the Royal College and the Victoria and Albert Museum, and then my PhD in the early 1990s at the V&A in the research department, I was somehow there was a direct line back to the relationship between the Royal College of Art, its collections, its approach to the education of designers, Henry Cole's understanding of the function of a museum, and the museum as it stands today. In Scotland, of course, and in Edinburgh College of Art, where I was lucky to be principal for 7 years. The South Kensington system of art education, that careful process of observation and drawing through a hierarchy of subject matter and media over time, and apprenticeship in looking and designing across all disciplines, had of course been spun out across the rest of the UK nations, and indeed through India and the British Empire through the late 19th century, early 20th century. And you could see legacies of the South Kensington system even in Edinburgh College of Art, just during the 7 years, through its cast collection and through the way that its disciplines were organised. So there is something about disciplinary organisation, Gottfried Semper's understanding of materials, and of the relation of that to education, that I think has always stayed with me and always informed the way I think about museums and their function.
Yeah, that was really going to be my question. I don't imagine you ever thought you would be the director of something that ranged as widely with flight and rural life and all of that, but you do seem quite at home. So it really was a question really of drawing out what from your background has been most useful or has prepared you most, because when you moved from Edinburgh College of Art into National Gallery Scotland, that seemed like a kind of natural, comfortable move, but also one in a way that took you maybe too much down the art path.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting to see it open up again. And you may have answered the question already, but was there something, in those early years in South Kensington that you feel really did prepare you unexpectedly?
I think
you did mention Cole, Henry Cole, and Gottfried Semper, both key figures, the architecture, but yeah.
Yeah, it may be something to do with the discipline of design history, material culture studies, and histories of technology, actually, that were important in terms of both curatorial knowledge and expertise at the V&A, and their relationship to the history of art. Of course, I was an undergraduate at the Curatorial Institute in the mid 1980s in history of art. I did feel that a return to the National Galleries of Scotland for 3 years after being at Edinburgh College of Art took me back into collections, which I'd missed very much. I was interested in the diversity of collections indeed at the National Galleries of Scotland, which moved from a portrait gallery to the great collection on the Mound, through to modern practice in all of its diversity in Belford Road. So there was an opportunity there to think cross disciplines still. That's Edinburgh College of Art.
I wanted to just show these quickly.
Just so people
and then also
that was the view. That was the view from my old office window at the National Gallery of Scotland. Wonderful view with the Charles Jenks land piece in front.
Yeah,
but a very
not
different,
too bad.
Yeah, very different institutional history at the galleries. Which took some getting used to for me. So I do feel like I've come back home in disciplinary terms to the museum.
And I mean, just very quickly, because we are in a university setting here, I mean, I'm very curious about this move from the South Kensington model of a very democratic, the museums being the true teachers of a free people, as Empress said, and Henry Cole's idea that it would be really the school for the nation. And of course, you followed through on that with the Royal College of Art, and then had this period at the Edinburgh College as well. Where do you see the kind of educational or research, sweet spot in the National Museum Scotland? Is it different?
This has been a real eye-opener for me, actually, Bill, and there is something incredibly progressive about the research agenda at National Museum Scotland, precisely because of its disciplinary diversity between science, technology, art, design, and world cultures. Like the V&A, it's an independent research organisation, so it works with partners in the higher education sector, but also in its own right in terms of its ability to apply for major research grants. And the ones that fascinate me are those that are located in the National Museum Collection Centre at Granton, which are in relation particularly to science around biodiversity and the challenge, environmental challenge that we face as a world at the moment. So we have collections that unlock for us some of the answers to future challenge in relation to the climate crisis.
I knew you had a few of these images later.
And that research, in a sense, yes, that's one. Scotland's Precious Seas, for example, is the research that underpins and makes vital our exhibition programme. And that was always something that I felt was so powerful about the V&A and the relationship that exhibition making was located within the research department. And there is something not the same, but similar at National Museum Scotland through these very active research programs that
fantastic, really, really exciting. We've just raced through these, but I did want to just touch on this pressing issue, been front and center for your experience, but of course for the whole museum sector. I don't know if you saw the Apollo magazine that just came out at the very beginning. It had the usual two views on one question, and it was really about, is the blockbuster dead? Is that model for museum economy that really we've all come to depend on in the last decade or two, and very, very strongly at the V&A with this huge exhibition program. And in fact, the defenders of the model were Jeff Marsh and Vicky Brokes, who did the David Bowie show and many other very popular and much visited exhibitions. And the counter voice was Nick Penny from the National Gallery, suggesting that actually we need to look at different models. Do you have a take on that before you get into the approach that you're actually taking? But do you have a take on whether the blockbuster is still viable, or are we now forced to look at a different way?
Well, it's interesting that you should say that, Bill, because over the Christmas period, I was interviewed for the Scotsman by one of our leading arts journalists, Brian Ferguson, here in Scotland. It was a double-page spread, just initial ideas, new director at National Museum Scotland. And we talked about the challenge of exhibition touring and exhibition making and exhibition's relationship with audiences as part of that. And I rather foolishly, I think, used the blockbuster word. I said, we're not moving into a world where the blockbuster will have any validity in the future. And it's not something that I want to promote. So the headline was "New Director Signals End of the Blockbuster," which several of my colleagues, I think, got rather nervous about, because that doesn't mean that exhibition culture stops. I'm a real defender of the sense that the making of an exhibition is a contribution to knowledge and is something that keeps the museum alive. But there are ways of doing exhibitions that don't mean we have to travel across the world and burn carbon in the way that we might have done before. And there are ways of making exhibitions that engage with audiences that don't undermine the experience one has within an exhibition. So an exhibition as an experimental piece, pushing the boundaries rather than confirming people's expectations, and an understanding of its value as a research vehicle is very important, I think. So I would certainly hold on to that notion of exhibition making as a core function of the Contemporary Museum.
Indeed. And also, of course, at the moment when we can't gather in such big numbers, we have to look for alternatives. And I wonder for you, what have been the approaches or at the Warburg, we've been very unexpectedly happy with the increase of audience engagement, particularly international audience engagement, that Zoom events program has brought to us. We didn't have that before. We had never done it. And it's more or less quadrupled our audience and completely inverted the makeup of our audience from a majority of London, because in-person events here, to international. How is that playing out for you?
Yeah, well, I'm thankful to that generation of museum directors who saw the value in digitizing their collections and putting them online, because my goodness, that investment in time and resource over the past 10, 20 years really of making collections accessible has really paid off over the past 5 years, I think, in ensuring that museums and collections are still accessible, visible in these darker times. So that's one thing. And it reminded me actually that right at the very start of my career, when I'd graduated from the Courtauld, my first job in, what was it, 1987, 1988, was in the Getty programme, looking at the Whit Library's collection and working with a database as they existed at that time to translate iconographic content of that collection into something searchable. That's always stayed with me. And when we closed our museums last March, April, we were able very quickly to turn around, to rethink our website and to make all of that material accessible, particularly for homeschooling, but also for the sorts of engagement that support programs like this, Bill, as well. Never ever replaces the material engagement with the object, though, and that was why there was such a sense of joy last July, August, when we started reopening our buildings in Scotland again, that because we only had capacity for 20% of our audiences, audiences also got a very intimate connection with the collection that they really enjoyed. So it's that combination of the digital and the material. A slight exhaustion perhaps with the digital at this moment, but as we've moved
indeed
down, so wait to get back to a sense of material engagement again.
And there is, I mean, there is a kind of intimacy that's possible that maybe the blockbuster model or the endless drive for as much footfall as possible has compromised.
Yes.
With, you know, close contact in small groups.
Yeah.
And I think you're lucky also to have outdoor spaces where you can of course explore those without as much restriction. Can we change tack for a little bit here and just go to this Legacies of Empire? And I'm really curious for next set of a couple questions to just reflect on what it means for you to be director of a national museum. It's not, you're not from Scotland, I don't think. And so it's an interesting question. I mean, I remember again at the V&A, it was very interesting thinking about these as national collections. And I myself eventually was director of those collections, but as a complete outsider. And I just wonder how it feels to you, first of all, and how you yourself activate about the national in the National Museum Scotland. What does that mean for you?
Yeah, well, national museums have a very particular function, and my colleagues at National Museums of Scotland are very aware of our national role. One of the things I think I've seen and felt and benefited from in the 10 years since I've been in Scotland is a strong sense of the common weal, a strong sense of connection between institutions, and a democratic sense of working for the common good through our assets as a nation. Without that sense of competition, in fact, that notion of growth for growth's sake that one might see or one might have seen in the past in other countries. So we have a really important function that's very much come into focus during the crisis to support other sectors within the museum and gallery world in Scotland. So that's a sort of internal national, we run training programs in terms of supporting smaller institutions. You know, institutions have had to open, close, put their collections into conservation while they're closed, while they're at risk. So we've been able to support colleagues and across the sector, independent museums, industrial museums, in that way. It's a strong, close-knit community. But as one of the biggest institutions, we have a wealth of curatorial knowledge and conservation expertise to allow us to share in that way, which I find incredibly enlightening. And then there's the role of a national within an international context as well. So sensing yourself as part of a peer network.
It's interesting. I was also in the National Museums of Wales year before last when I was on the judges panel for the Museum of the Year, and we actually awarded the National History Museum, St. Fagans, the Museum of the Year. And one of the things that impressed us most, had many similarities to what you've described, but one of the things that impressed us most was the way in which it represented the people. It really had a very strong social, even when it wasn't about social history, it had a very, very strong engagement with national identity, democratic ideals, process, and in fact, the whole way in which it tried to engage with the community as it rebuilt itself or as it curated. Capturing local knowledge, all of those things. I mean, again, is there a strong sense? I don't feel that that's something that's particularly noticeable in the London National Museums, but I wonder if it's part of your experience in Edinburgh.
There's a sense of ownership, public ownership of the collections that is quite different, perhaps, to some of the London Nationals. That may also reflect the different funding arrangements that we have north and south of the border, whereas the London Nationals over the past 10 years the proportion of taxpayers' money supporting those institutions is roughly 30-70, possibly less now, 30 public funding taxpayers' money. It's the opposite in Scotland. So we are very lucky to be generously funded 70% by the taxpayer, by Scottish government, with 30% in terms of the revenue we bring in from our commercial activities. That makes quite a difference, and that, you know, evolves from this democratic approach, I think, to the collections. The other side of that is that there is a vigorous public discourse around the way those collections are used. So there is a sense of a public debate, intellectual debate, that one is challenged, productively, constructively, critically challenged, very directly in Scottish.
So I wanted to ask you, particularly with this slide in front of us, you know, about the issues that are playing out so strongly in the national museums in major capitals, really around all of the imperial countries. And of course, France, Belgium, we know about those. We know about the interventions around the British Museum and its colonial and imperial legacies. And I'm curious, again, really more out of ignorance about how that debate is playing out in Scotland, and again, what you as an institution are doing about it. It's something certainly that the public is driving. So it's a very socially driven, Yeah,
no, highly relevant topic. So this was an exhibition at the War Museum, Legacies of Empire, that opened in November, just before Christmas, based on an Arts and Humanities Research Council project run by Henry Litchie, who was formerly at the National Museums of Scotland, perhaps known to you, Bill, as well, but now I think Director of Collections at the World Museum, the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam and Leiden. And Stuart Allen, our Keeper of Scottish History and Archaeology. And it's a very focused, timely exhibition about the notion of military collecting within a legal, ethical context. 3 years AHRC funding to think about the different categories in which objects in regimental museums and in other museums, our museum, were collected in different ways. The legal concept of loot, for example, and tracking those through particular objects. Being transparent about that, providing audiences with the information that they might require to understand what has become a highly heated public conversation. So that was happening, and like all museums, we're looking very carefully at our interpretation and looking very carefully at our programming and engagement in particular. So it's as relevant here as it is in London, I think.
Are there any? I was just going to ask: are there any areas of the collection that are actually being under pressure for repatriation, or have you got these sharp edge of the question issues?
Yeah, we have the Discoveries Gallery in the centre of our Chamber Street museum was recurated probably about 15 years ago. And it sits at the core of Chamber Street, and it was designed as a way of orientating the visitor towards the history of collections in the centre of the museum. But it did that through the particular prism of imperial histories as they existed in the 1990s and late 1980s. That sort of John Mackenzie school, I suppose, of thinking about empire and its relationship to home and abroad. And in a Scottish context, it was about inventors, explorers, and had increasingly become over the years quite a focus for critical debate about how communities of origin were represented, their objects were represented through the prism of Scottish exploration and Scotland's role in empire. So we're having to think very carefully around that, with engagement with those communities of origin, both in Scotland and elsewhere, and redesigning it as a result of the events of the summer. So that will be a good example, I think, of the way one has to be highly reactive, open, transparent, and connected in the current context, without falling into the trap of entering into a culture war, as they call it. Another term that should be banned, like blockbuster, I think, as an unhelpful category of debate in many ways.
Indeed, indeed. Chris, I'm going to go back finally, before I close this slideshow and actually open up to some questions from the audience, to this, because it is important, not just to show what you've worked on and how productive you've been, but also to think finally a little bit about your own interests as a curator, as a scholar. So I'm just curious, do you have, the hard question is, do you have any time for it? But maybe COVID's given you time to do some more research and writing. I don't know. But do you have curatorial or research or writing projects that you want to just finish by telling us a little bit about?
Yeah, no, I'm still passionate about the material that I'm lucky enough to be that it is my responsibility to look after with colleagues at the moment. So I'm still an active writer, not too much time for archival research or prolonged projects, but I've just completed actually an essay for a forthcoming Victoria and Albert Museum, one of those things that's been happening over the last 3 years, an exhibition in their future program around masculinities, dress and deportment. So that focus on fashion, textiles, and their connection with identity, I think I'll always be interested in. I'll always be interested in thinking about the museum's role in urban culture and through capital cities. Always be interested in the relationship of design to national identity that you can see there through the exhibition that we did at the V&A during Olympic year 2012. Seems a long time ago now. So I think
it is a long time.
you must try and keep your hand and eye in. It probably just trickles out now as irregular blog posts for National Museums of Scotland to reflect on things and be open about them. But yeah, I thoroughly believe in it.
You should, and I hope you do find the time. It's super important, and it is one of the fears I think about taking on these big jobs, is that, will you give up that time that you've had? On the other hand, you are immersed in that collection in a way that nobody else is. And I remember that sense of walking through a museum, particularly when it's closed, and that intimate sense of contact with the collection and its history.
Yeah.
And you've really drawn that out beautifully. Well, look, I'm going to stop